guys, welcome back to Lesson 55, Revive School. I'm Wesley, and part of the Revive Texas team, and just back in the Psalms. Having a fun time. Listen to Ryan, listen to Kyle, and it's fun, man, just to jump in these Psalms. There's a lot of nuggets in here. And you really see the heart of guys. When they really start crying out and pressing in, you really start to see their true heart. So I hope you're enjoying going through the Psalms. I hope you're having a good time. Keep pressing in. But today we're going to be in Psalm 63. And so actually in Psalm 63, in my Bible it says it's a Psalm of David. So David's actually the author, but it was written when he was in the desert of Judah. Well, you guys have been through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so you know he was in the desert of Judah quite a bit. And so if you dial this thing in, there's two kind of theories that where this psalm was actually penned, and I think there's both of them. You can bridge both of them. Both of them were penned when actually David was fleeing. The first school of thought would say that it was actually in, Kevin, if you want to go to 1 Samuel 23, 1 Samuel 23, it's actually when David was fleeing from Saul. And so David actually fled from Saul quite a bit. But in 1 Samuel 23:15, we'll just kind of cruise through some of this. I'm just going to kind of get you in two frames of context. This is the first one, David fleeing from Saul. He was anointed by Samuel to be king. He killed Goliath. He was doing all this stuff. And then next thing you know, Saul gets jealous and realizes David's going to replace him, and he starts trying to kill him to get rid of his opposition. So David's in a posture of fleeing. And so you guys know that he's already said, I'm not going to touch God's anointed. He could have killed Saul many times, but he didn't. But in this is where we're at, 1 Samuel 23:15. It says, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, got it right, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And so, I'm sorry, Kevin, can you back up 2 verses? I want to back up 2 verses here. This is kind of where it starts. So David and his men, about 600 of them. Sometimes when you think about David fleeing, you think it's just him and his 33 guys, but no, there's a whole pile of people. 600 in number. David and his men and some of their family, they left Keilah and they kept moving from place to place. And so I just want to kind of pause right here because think about this, because we're going to talk about it in a minute. When you're fleeing, you're moving from place to place all the time. I've never been a fugitive of the law, but they're always working over their shoulder and they're moving. They have to move all the time because if you stay in one place, you'll get caught. And so in David's life, they're moving from place to place. So when Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he didn't go there. Verse 14. David actually stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph, and day after day, listen to that, day after day, Saul was searching for him to do what? To kill him. And not just him, all the people around him. But watch this transition. But God did not give David into his hands. Verse 15. While David was in Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take him. So he come out to take his life. So David would move, Saul would hunt him down again, and God would tell him, hey, you got to go. And God continued to spare his life because he knew what Saul was doing, and he was relaying David through the Spirit what Saul was doing and through people. So this is kind of the context of that. Kevin, if you want to go to one more verse, verse 19 through 26, there's a little bit more context here. It can be here at Horesh, or it could be here just right a couple verses after this. It says the Ziphites in the wilderness of Zin, actually, the people of the town actually went to Saul. And they actually I would call it ratted David out where I'm from. They told on him. They said, hey, ain't you hunting this David guy? They were trying to get favor with Saul. Well, man, he's right over here in our lap. You should come get him. We know where he's at. And so verse 19, verse 20, you see he starts to move. But this is what Saul tells the Ziphites. And this kind of gives you context to what David was constantly facing. Not only was he fleeing from Saul, but there was tons of people that were trying to gain favor with Saul and was loyal to Saul everybody was looking for David. And so in 20 it says, this is what Saul says, now your majesty come down wherever it pleases us with the Ziphites, verse 21. So Saul replies, the Lord bless you for concern for me. He's like, thank you for being so concerned for me. Verse 22, would you please go down back to where you're from, and would you find where David usually goes? And when you see him, tell me where he is. And he's very crafty. You're going to have to hunt him down. And so David's doing what? He has to move again. And so in verse 23, he says they find out about their hiding places. He says he's going to track him down. Verse 24, so they went out from Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Moan, which is still in that desert of Judah. Next verse, Kevin. I think 25 and 26 is where I really want to get you guys to. So Saul and his men began the search. And when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the desert of Manon. And when Saul heard this, he went to the desert. Next verse. Saul was going on one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side of the mountain. So picture that. not only is he going from place to place, but it seems like they're circling this mountain. It's like, so here David is, he's on one side of the mountain, and here on the other side of the mountain, and he's hurrying to get away from Saul. And so you see David in this Saul's in this constant pursuit of him, trying to close in on David and kill him. And so this is actually the first school of thought would say Psalm 63 was penned in this desert scenario. Not necessarily the exact pinpoint time, but in this wilderness, fleeing from Saul is when David actually wrote Psalm 63. And so, to be honest, I'm kind of in the middle, but I'm going to give you both of them and you have to decide for yourself. So the next one would be, the context would be not what after David become king, and Absalom has actually gotten favor with the people around him, he started fleeing from Absalom because Absalom was trying to take over the throne. So Kevin, if you'll go to 2 Samuel 15, we're just going to jump in right here briefly. It's verse 13 through 18. And so if you remember, we talked about Psalms 51. Part of the consequence of David's sin, he said, the sword will not depart from your house. And then Absalom, his son, actually raised up and turned his heart to take the throne away from his own dad. So David and Absalom's father-son relationship here, this is where 2 Samuel 15:13 starts. A messenger came and told David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. Then David said to all his officials and all the men who were with him, David was king, right? He was king, all these officials that were around him. He said to his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he'll move quickly and overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword. So what he was saying is, hey, Absalom has turned the hearts of the people. If we don't leave now, we're all going to be dead. Because the king, he's not going to leave any survivors. And he's got the people's backing. And so David has to make a choice. What are we going to do? And so he starts to flee again. Not only did he flee from Saul, now he's fleeing from his own son. Verse 15. The king's official answered him and said, your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord, your king, chooses. Next verse. I think we're going to go through 18. So David the king set out with his entire household. Key word there. It wasn't just David and his warriors. No, it was his whole household. He set out with his entire household and he started following. They all followed him. He left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. Verse 17. So the king set out. King David sets out. All the people followed him. They halt at the edge of the city. Verse 18. And his men start to march past him. And this is kind of context for you. Along with the Karetites, the Pelethites, and all 600 Gittites who accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. This kind of gives you a little bit of numerically how many people left with David. It wasn't just 20 guys and his few kids. No, it was the whole crew. They left. This massive army of people is fleeing out of town. Kevin, if you will go to verse 16 too. This kind of gives you context of this wilderness experience. 2 Samuel 16:2. So as they're going out, this is actually the king asked Ziba. I'm trying to get you there without giving you all these scriptures. Ziba's actually the overseer of Mephibosheth you guys read about. So when David starts to flee, Ziba starts to flee too. He brings him some food, some donkeys to ride on. But notice what he says at the end. He brings him, I'll just read it. The king asked Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered to him, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, so you don't have to walk. The bread and the fruit are for those men to eat. And the wine is to refresh those who become what? Exhausted in the wilderness. So what you see here is when they flee from Absalom, where do they go? They go to the wilderness. They go to the wilderness area, which is the Judean desert, when they're fleeing from Absalom. The only thing I'll say that may point towards this, one of the arguments that says this is actually when it happened and not the other, is simply, Kevin, if you'll go back to Psalm 63. We'll look at the last verse, verse 11. There's kind of one little nugget here that I think could go either way, but it seems to maybe go towards the ladder of Absalom. David ends Psalm 63:11 by saying, but the king will rejoice in God. So if it was before King Saul was fleeing, he hadn't become king yet. And so I think the reason why people take the Absalom is because here he's already talking about, I'm the king, I'm going to rejoice in God, which would make more sense towards Absalom. But not to confuse you, I think we can draw from either one of these stories. So what I want to do is I just kind of want you to get in the posture of what was the environment that David was living in, whether it was in fleeing from Saul or whether it was fleeing from Absalom. He was in the Judean desert. And so I think sometimes we read these, but we don't actually put ourselves maybe in his shoes to what he was facing. So if you think about the Judean desert, it's an arid, rocky region. It's west of the Dead Sea. So you have Dead Sea. West of the Dead Sea is the Judean desert. It's pretty large. It's very vast. But when you think of desert, it's not like North Georgia. There's not a lot of trees. Actually, there's hardly any trees. Ain't low like this ground dirt that you can plant stuff in. It's desert. It's sand. It's arid. And you'll see in 63, there's not a lot of water. And as Ziba gave them food, there's not a lot of food either. Man, there's a lot going on. And man, walking by faith in this arena and moving everybody around, it wasn't like God, he was just running and hiding under rocks. No, there was a massive amount of people having to shift back and forth, which really gives you a higher and maybe larger perspective of the miraculous thing God was actually doing of hiding David. You can hide 2 or 3 people, but hiding hundreds of people is very difficult, especially when there ain't a lot of places to hide. And so physically, emotionally, who knows, shame, there's all kinds of things going on, frustration, anger. I can't imagine what David walked through on a daily basis as he walked through this wilderness or this desert area. And so the reason why I wanted to set that up for you as you were doing Psalm 63, because that makes this psalm come to life. It puts it on a way grander scale. He wasn't sitting in a house in a building as he was speaking this out. He was in a place where he was being pressed. He was in a place where he was physically suffering. And it wasn't just him, it was the people around him. And so I want you to kind of keep that dialogue going in your mind as you read Psalm 63. So let's go ahead and jump into text. If you want to look at Psalm 63 verse 1, it should be on the screen in front of you. It says this. This is David's initial start. You are my God. You God are my God. Earnestly I'll seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there's no water. So I just kind of want to break this down, Kevin, if you want to stay in verse 1, and really just talk about the first one. You can get the context of the bottom means what? He's talking about the desert area. He's in a dry and parched land. So when you think about dry, I think of absolutely no water. Arid. You with me? It's dry. And then when you think about parched, when things are parched, they're burnt up. It's not what I would say a land full of milk and honey. It's parched, it's dry, it's not necessarily there. It even says there's no water, but what? David's response is significantly different than I believe most people's would be. He responds in a way that's amazing. And so I want to kind of start and see, how does David walk through these situations? How does David lead all these people? And what was the source? And what can we learn from David in Psalm 63 that we can add to our own life so that when we may get into these places or these seasons of dryness or parched in our life, how can we live and actually prosper through hard times? And so I want to look at this, the first part of verse 1. It says, you God. He's not talking to Allah. He's not talking to Buddha. He's not talking to Muhammad. He says, you are my God. You, God, are my God. And the minute I started reading this, it became personal to me. It's not you are God. He says, you are my God. David knew God. He knew God personally. He knew God on a level that wasn't about, hey, my daddy loves Jesus. No, he loved Him. He loved God. And so as I was processing and studying this, man, I had a Bible on my desk that I hadn't picked up in a long time. This is actually the Bible that my mom had. My mom died in, I think, 2003. And so I think she died at 48 of cancer. I was lost when my mom died. If you would have asked me in those days if I was saved, I'd have said, heck yeah, I love Jesus. I'm saved. There was no truth to that. I'd been taught when I grew up, man, about Jesus. I knew all about Him. My mom took me to church my whole life. I was born in church, and there never was a time in my life when my mom wasn't taking me to church. But the reality of it is I knew about God, but I didn't know Him. But I thought I was okay. Because what had happened to me, I had internalized what my mom was doing. I knew I was all right because my mom loved Jesus. I would come down the steps of the morning, there'd be my mom praying in the living room. Her devotion to God was amazing. But the problem was, I couldn't say the first part of this verse. I believe God was, but He wasn't personal to me. And so when I read this, you are my God, David had made God personal. It wasn't a God here. No, God, he knew God. He knew God's voice. He knew how God worked. He knew how God acted. God was his keeper, his shepherd. All through the Psalms, you see David talking about who God is. And that's kind of where I want to start with you. Has God been personal in your life? Do you know about Him or do you really know Him? Has there been a time in your life where you said, you know what, God, I'm done. Forgive me of my sins. I'm going to follow you. And you started meeting with God on a personal level. Because here's what happens. When I met Jesus, I've never been the same. And I think you'll see this in Psalm 63. David was meeting with God, and in that, he never was the same. And so what's your personal story? How could David say, God, you're my God? So as I was processing that, I thought about, I'll just go to a couple scriptures here. In David's life, before Goliath, he was a shepherd. How is it as a shepherd boy that David actually knew? How could he say, Kevin, if you want to go to 1 Samuel 17:33, how did he learn God? How did he get to this point where he could say, you're my God? And it was more personal, like you're going to see through Psalm 63. What was his life experiences? So this is when David was facing Goliath. Saul replies to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're only just a young man. And he has been a warrior from his youth. This guy's going to kill you. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep as a shepherd boy. When a lion or a bear came and carried off sheep from the flock, I went after it and I struck it and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Next verse. Your servant has killed the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. David learned how to meet with God as a shepherd. He saw God. He didn't just hear about God. He sought God, but then God showed up in a mighty way. He says, God was my God when I was a shepherd boy, and nobody wanted to pick me. When my daddy brought all the other boys up, and nobody said, you can't use David. He's just a little ruddy kid. And then I was anointed king. God was his God when he stood up in front of Goliath, similar in this text, and he slew the giant with a couple stones in the flip. David knew, even fleeing from Saul or Absalom, that God had always been. When he sought Jesus and he sought God, he never left him. And so when you start in Psalm 63, when he got in the wilderness, when he got into another tight spot, his first declaration is, God, you're my God. And then he says this, earnestly I'm going to seek you. That word earnestly there, it translates into early. Some translations say, early I'm going to seek you. And so in that, this discipline, and that's kind of where I want to go in Psalm 63 with you. I think we just think, man, David was a great guy, man. I wish I could serve Jesus or serve God like he did. When he says, early will I seek you, how many people like to sleep in? I don't like to sleep in alone, but I'm telling you, getting up at 6 o'clock ain't my favorite thing to do. But what I've learned in my life is if I don't get up early, it ain't going to happen. Maybe it happens different from you, but here's what I'm asking you. What's your discipline? If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Kevin, let's look at verse 24 and 27. You can learn the same thing from the Apostle Paul. So Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24, he says, do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? So you need to run in such a way to get the prize. Next verse. Everyone who competes in the game goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, Paul said this, I don't run like someone running aimlessly. I don't fight like a boxer just punching in the air, just beating in the air. No, Paul said this, I strike a blow to my body. I bring my body into subjection. I make it a slave so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. This text simply talks about Paul's lifestyle. He had a lifestyle of discipline. He didn't just randomly do things. No, he said he had to train his body. It's like a runner, or a boxer. You're not just boxing to beat the air. No, there's discipline behind it. You're not just getting early to check the box because you did a devotion and read. No, the discipline is what? When you discipline yourself to seek God, there's benefit. You start to become like Him. Because in your discipline, it creates devotion. Kevin, if you want to go back to Psalm 63, we're still in verse 1. It says this, in His discipline, earnestly I sought you in the morning. And then what? My soul thirsts for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land. When you discipline yourself to meet with God, up front it may be awkward. It may be duty. It may be dutiful, like, hey, I got to do this. I don't want to do it. I got to do this. I don't want to do it. But if you'll continue with the discipline, what happens in your discipline, it becomes a devotion. Your soul starts to learn and yearn for the presence of God, His Word, what He's doing. And in your devotion, what happens, He starts to change your desire. So Kevin, if you'll go to verse 2. What happens is back up to verse 1. I skipped over one part. Your desire changes what? He says, my soul, I thirst for you. And then he says, my whole being, my whole body yearns for you. So in your discipline, it creates devotion. And your devotion actually becomes a desire where you long to meet with God. David longed to meet. You'll see it in a couple more. He longed to be in God's presence, no matter if he was in the desert. He didn't run from it. And then in that desire, what God does, He starts to transform your life. Look at verse 3. Excuse me, Kevin, verse 2. Verse 2 says this, I've seen you in the sanctuary. Now think about this for a minute. Where was David talking about? He's seen God in the temple, the tabernacle. He's seen the tabernacle. He's seen God in the tabernacle. He's seen His presence. And it says this, He has beheld His power and His glory. As you read this, this is my heart for you. Have you been in the presence of the Lord? Have you experienced His power and glory? He's the King of glory. And because here's what happens. Isaiah saw it in 6. You don't have to go there, Kevin, but in Isaiah 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. And then he says, hey, I'm a man of unclean lips. In the presence of God, he became exposed. And then after he became exposed, God opened his eyes up to what was around him. He became transformed. He was being transformed by the power and glory of God. And his response was, God, here am I, send me. The one encounter with God so transformed, he was ready to go. So when I talk about discipline and devotion and desire and the presence of God, sometimes I think we get so in the letter of the law and the knowledge-based discipleship or what we're doing that sometimes we miss the presence. We click through the Scripture, we click through what we're doing, and sometimes God, all He wants to do is meet with you. He wants to meet with you. He wants to speak with you. He wants to show Himself strong on your behalf. But David says this, I wake up early to get in the presence of God. And this is what happens when he gets in the presence of God. Look at verse 3. He said, in the presence, I'm transformed by your love, because your love is better than life, and my lips will glorify you. In God's presence, you learn His love. The most miraculous thing about the time I got saved was God shouldn't have been there, but He was. And the only reason why He showed up that night was one thing, He loved me. It's the goodness of God that draws men to repentance. And the more you walk in love, the more you can trust the Father. And so in 63:3, he experiences the love of God. He's transformed by the experiential love of God that he finds in His presence and in His Word. And then verse 4, what happens? Your worship, your love turns into worship. And you get in the presence, you start pressing in with God. You experience His love. You experience His heart. And the next thing, your lips start to praise God. He praises Him as long as he lives. You start to be transformed, metamorphed. I think Romans 12:2 says, don't conform, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And he says, not only will I praise you with my lips, I'm going to lift my hands up and start praising you, Lord. Verse 5. And as you start worshiping, here's the cool thing that happens. Satisfaction comes from being in the presence of God. The craziest thing about worship and adoration is sometimes I believe you're more blessed by it sometimes than God. It's getting in God's presence, worshiping the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and there's this crazy contentment and satisfaction where you just want to sit in the presence of God, sit at His feet. It says, David said, in His presence, I'm fully satisfied with the richest of food. In His presence, as just like I was if I was sitting at the table with all His food. He's in the desert. He's remembering all this food, but he ain't worried about food. Why? Because he's in God's presence, and there's satisfaction and contentment seeking God and in His presence. And he said, I'm going to sing with my lips, and I'm going to praise you. Kevin, if you want to go to verse 6. And then he releases something that kind of brought me back to Joshua. It says, and on my bed I'll remember you. It seems like there's a meditation here where David wasn't only praising God in the morning. When he woke up, he was seeking the Lord. When he went to bed, he was remembering what God had done for him. He was remembering the goodness of God in the land of the living. He was remembering what God's Word, His promises, and how He was anointed king. And then the transition in this verse 6 is, I think of you through the watches of the night. And so you've seen this before, like Jesus, when He walked on water, it said in the third watch, I think, of night, He was walking on water. So this watches of the night, they would set people out and they would watch. There were always somebody watching, especially when people are hunting you or trying to do something to you, they're watching. But even in the watches of the night, when the enemy's trying to come in and get you and there's fear, David said, I'm thinking of God and His provision and His protection as the watches of the night continue. So verse 7, as he meditates, he starts to shift into this strength. As he remembers God, it's because you're my help. You've always been my help. You've always been my help and ever-present help in trouble. And he says, I'll sing in the shadow of your wings. So if you process wings right, you hide under the shadow of His wings. So he's strengthened here, you're my help. Verse 8, and then you see this process of clinging. Your right hand will uphold me. I can't imagine having all these people under my leadership. And king, or my son trying to be king, Absalom, is trying to hunt me down and kill me. But David's faith wasn't in his right hand. Although I'd say he had a pretty rough right hand. He was a mighty man of God, but his faith was in God's right hand, that God said, I'm going to do this and I'm going to sustain you. And that was what he rested in. So you see this strength actually led to a confidence David had, that God hadn't forsaken him. And through this season, he was going to worship and he was going to praise him. So Kevin, if you'll go to verse 9. Verse 9, you see this. There starts to be this shift in David where he's seeking to be destroyed. But when you start trusting in Jesus and trusting His right arm and what God was doing, this was His declaration of protection. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. I don't know how God's going to do it, but He's going to deliver me. And it's probably not going to be by my hand. It's going to be by His hand. He could have killed Saul anytime, could have killed Absalom, but He didn't put His hands on him. Somebody else did. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. They'll go down into the depths of the earth. Verse 10. They'll be given over to the sword and become food for jackals. So that's a kind of crazy picture, but picture it for just a second. They'll be killed by the sword, and the only way to become food with jackals is they don't get buried. That was a negative, like a curse thing back then, that you didn't have a proper burial when you died. Jackals are somewhat of a dog, something similar, I would say, to a coyote. That's the ones that eat you. Verse 11, and then he says this, but the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in Him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced. David was squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. He was put in situations where only God, either the good or the bad is going to come out, and good came out. And so you see God, and you see God using David to lead His people and do amazing things. And so here's why I want to land the plane. How about us? Where are we at in our discipline? We talked about God being our God. Well, He is your God. Most of you, probably more than all of you, you're seeking God. But have you come to the place where you're disciplining yourself? I know this, if you're doing Revive School, you got to be disciplined. This ain't easy business. But I pray that in your discipline in the Word, you wouldn't miss the presence of God. Because part of discipline is you're devoting yourself to God. Because He wants to be your desire. He wants you to long after Him, not just after knowledge, after Him. He's the God of the Bible. The Bible was written so you'd know about Him. And so as you're seeking the Word, you need to seek Him. But in your devotion, all of a sudden your desires start to change. Just keep walking it out. But in your desires you start to transform. You're actually metamorphed. David said, hey man, God, this love, I've never experienced it before. And your love and your transformation in the presence of God turns into worship. Don't be scared to worship. Because when you worship, God sets you free. And as you worship God, you just got to keep pressing in. But be satisfied. And that's my heart for you guys at Revive School, that you know the Word, but you know the God of the Word. And we can say in David, no matter if it's good or bad, no matter if I got a job or I don't have a job, no matter if my checking account's full or it's not full, my power bill's paid or not, what? God is my God. And in a dry and thirsty land, I'm going to seek Him. Because I'm not seeking Him for His hand, I'm seeking Him for who He is in His presence. So that's my challenge for you today at Revive School, that you might get alone, spend some time with God, spend some time with Jesus, and reflect on Psalm 63. And as you process that, just go through those stages with God, talking to Him. But know this, He's the glory and the lifter of your head. He's your God. So God bless you. Have a great day with Revive School. You guys have fun in Psalms.